I lay paralyzed on the freezing operating table, watching Lucas, my husband, order the surgeon to carve out my kidney and kill our unborn child just to save his mistress. The metallic scent of blood and antiseptic filled my nose, making my stomach churn with a nausea that felt all too real, while the blinding surgical lights above burned into my retinas like the eyes of a judging god. I tried to move my fingers, tried to scream, but the paralytic agent coursing through my veins turned my body into a heavy stone, leaving me trapped inside my own flesh, forced to witness the end of my life. Lucas stood there, looking dashing in his Italian suit, checking his Rolex watch with an air of impatience that sliced through my heart deeper than any scalpel could. He did not look at me with love, or even pity, but rather with the cold calculation of a businessman liquidating a bad asset. Beside him stood Bella, clutching his arm with her manicured nails. Her face feigned a look of worry that did not reach her predatory eyes, which gleamed with the triumph of a woman who had finally won the prize. I heard Lucas speak, his voice devoid of the warmth I had known for 3 years, saying that the baby was just a complication, a biological error that could be fixed with a simple incision. He leaned down, not to kiss me goodbye, but to whisper into my ear that I should be grateful my death would serve a higher purpose, which was keeping Bella alive for his public image. The betrayal was a physical blow, a crushing weight that made my lungs burn for air, as I realized that the man I had sacrificed everything for was not a savior, but a butcher waiting for the right moment to strike. The surgeon, a man with cold eyes and a mask that hid his expression, picked up the gleaming silver scalpel, the light reflecting off its deadly edge, and I watched in horror as he brought it down toward my exposed abdomen. The fear was primal, a screaming panic that echoed silently in my skull, begging for mercy, begging for someone to wake me from this nightmare. But the reality of the pain felt absolute. I felt the cold metal touch my skin, a sharp sting that promised oblivion. And in that split second, I saw Lucas smile, a small, cruel curving of his lips that shattered the last fragment of love I held for him. He was not being forced into this, nor was he desperate, but rather he was enjoying the power he held over my life and death, proving that to him. I was nothing more than a spare parts warehouse for the woman he actually valued. I wanted to curse him, to scream that I was the heiress of the greatest medical empire in the world, that my net worth could buy his entire lineage 1,000 times over. But the secret died in my throat along with my breath. The blade pushed deeper. The searing pain flared white-hot, and I braced myself for the darkness of death, accepting that my foolish quest for true love had led me to this cold, sterile slaughterhouse. I saw the monitor flatline, the high-pitched tone signaling the end of my heartbeat, and I watched Lucas turn away, already pulling out his phone to check the stock market, indifferent to the carcass of his wife cooling on the table behind him. The darkness swallowed me whole, a suffocating void that felt like the end of existence. Until suddenly, the world shattered into a million fragments of digital light. My eyes snapped open, gasping for air as if I had just surfaced from the deep ocean, my lungs burning with the sudden influx of oxygen in the climate-controlled air of the laboratory. I was not in a dirty underground clinic, nor was I bleeding out on a table, but lying inside the sleek, white capsule of the neural simulation unit at the headquarters of Zen Medical in downtown Manhattan. The glass canopy of the pod hissed softly as it slid open, releasing the pressurized mist that kept my body in stasis during the dive. And I sat up, my hands trembling not from fear, but from the aftershocks of the hyper-realistic trauma I had just endured. I ripped the neural sensors from my temples, the sticky pads coming off with a sharp pull, and looked over at the adjacent pod where Lucas was still sleeping peacefully, completely unaware that the last hour of his life had been a constructed hallucination. He looked so innocent in his sleep. His breathing, rhythmic and calm. A stark contrast to the monster who had just ordered my execution in the virtual world. I stepped out of the pod, my bare feet touching the cold marble floor, and walked over to the main control console, where the data streams were still scrolling rapidly across the massive holographic screens. The text on the screen was red, a glaring confirmation of what I had just experienced. Subject: Lucas Graver. Empathy level 0. Narcissism level critical. Choice, selection, murder. I stared at the data, the cold, hard numbers quantifying the rot in his soul, and felt a tear slide down my cheek. Not for him, but for the 3 years of my youth I had wasted playing the role of a poor orphan to find a man who loved me for me. The mechanism of the neural simulation was the crown jewel of Zen Medical, a technology worth billions that could project a shared dream state directly into the subconscious mind, creating scenarios so real that the brain could not distinguish them from reality. I had drugged Lucas's wine at dinner, brought him here under the cover of night with my private security team, and hooked him up to the machine to run the ultimate loyalty test before I revealed my true identity as the chairwoman. The scenario was simple: simulate a crisis where he had to choose between his pregnant wife and his mistress, with a life or death stake that would strip away all social masks and reveal his true nature. I had hoped, with every fiber of my being, that the simulation would end with him saving me, that the man who whispered sweet promises in our small apartment was real. But the machine did not lie. It accessed the deepest pathways of the brain, bypassing the logical centers that allow for lying, and forced the subject to act on their core desires and instincts. Lucas's core instinct was self-preservation and greed, and he had chosen to discard me without a second of hesitation the moment I became a liability to his lifestyle. I wiped a tear away, my expression hardening into a mask of ice, realizing that the man in the pod was not my husband, but a parasite that I needed to excise from my life. My assistant, Arthur, who was also the head legal counsel for the corporation, stepped out of the shadows, his face grim as he handed me a tablet with the simulation results already compiled into a legal dossier. He did not speak, for the silence in the room was heavy enough to crush a lesser woman. But his eyes asked the question that I had already answered in my heart. I looked at Arthur and gave a slight nod, signaling him to initiate the wake-up protocol for Lucas, but to erase his memory of the simulation so he would think he had just fallen asleep in the car on the way home. We needed him to believe that his dark desires were still secret, that he was still the master of the game, so that I could crush him in the real world with the full force of my legal and financial power. The technicians in the room, all sworn to absolute secrecy under penalty of lawsuits that would span generations, began to disconnect the wires from Lucas, moving with the silent efficiency of ghosts. I quickly changed out of the simulation suit and back into the cheap, worn-out clothes I wore as Elena the orphan, the disguise that had been my skin for 3 long years. I looked at my reflection in the dark glass of the monitor, seeing a woman who looked tired and weak, the perfect victim for a predator like Lucas. But behind those eyes burned the fury of a titan who controlled 51% of the city's medical infrastructure. I remembered the clause in my mother's will, the one that forced me to live in obscurity, to learn the value of humanity, and realized that the only thing I had learned was that humanity was a commodity that could be bought and sold. Lucas began to stir in the pod, a low groan escaping his lips, and I signaled the team to clear the room, leaving only me and the illusion of our poverty. I sat on a chair next to him, feigning the look of a worried wife, while inside my chest, my heart was beating a war drum, preparing for the battle that would leave him with nothing but his regrets. Lucas opened his eyes, blinking in confusion as he looked around the room, which we had quickly reconfigured to look like a private recovery room in a standard hospital, a set we kept ready for such deceptions. He looked at me, and for a split second, I saw the shadow of the murderer from the simulation in his gaze. A flicker of disappointment that I was still alive, before he masked it with his practiced charm. He reached out and touched my hand, his skin feeling clammy and repulsive against mine, and asked what happened, his voice thick with fake concern. I told him he had fainted at dinner and I had brought him to the emergency room. A lie that slid off my tongue like poison, and watched as his brain processed the information. Calculating how this affected his schedule with Bella, he squeezed my hand, smiling that serpentine smile, and told me he had a terrible nightmare where he lost me, and that he was so glad I was safe. The audacity of his lie was breathtaking. A masterpiece of gaslighting that would have worked on the old Elena. But the new Elena, the one who had seen him order her death, only felt a cold amusement. I played along, squeezing his hand back, and told him that I also had a bad dream. One where he was a monster. But that dreams are not real. He laughed, a hollow sound that bounced off the walls, and suggested we go home because he had big news for me about a business opportunity. Unaware that the only business remaining for him was his inevitable bankruptcy, I helped him stand up, acting the part of the supportive wife, while mentally reviewing the list of assets he thought he owned, preparing to seize them one by one. We walked out of the building, Lucas leaning heavily on me to maintain the facade of weakness, while I supported his weight, feeling like I was carrying a corpse that had not yet realized it was dead. The night air of New York was biting cold, biting at my exposed skin. But it felt refreshing compared to the suffocating atmosphere of lies I had been breathing. As we got into our modest sedan, Lucas checked his phone, hiding the screen from me. But I knew he was texting Bella, probably telling her that the plan was delayed but not cancelled. I started the car, the engine sputtering with age, and drove us toward the small apartment in Queens that he hated so much. The place he called a rat hole, unaware that I owned the entire block and was simply letting us live there to test his humility. He began to talk about the future, about how his company was on the verge of a breakthrough, and how soon we would move to a penthouse in Manhattan. I listened, nodding at the appropriate times, knowing that his company was actually leveraged to the hilt and that the breakthrough he was banking on was likely the money he planned to get from selling my kidney on the black market. A scheme he thought was original but was actually a cliché of desperate men. He looked at me and said that I needed to get a checkup soon, that he was worried about my health, laying the groundwork for the medical abduction he was planning. I smiled, a tight, thin line, and told him he was right, that we should both get checkups, specifically at Zen Medical, because I heard they had the best doctors. He paled slightly at the mention of the hospital, likely because he had debts or shady dealings there, but agreed quickly, thinking he could manipulate the doctors with bribes. The drive home was a silent chess match, with him thinking he was grandmaster while I knew he was already in checkmate. When we arrived at the apartment, the smell of stale air and cheap furniture greeted us, a reminder of the life I had forced myself to endure. Lucas went straight to the shower, claiming he felt dirty from the hospital, likely trying to wash off the guilt that didn't exist in his conscience. I stood in the living room, looking at the wedding photo on the mantel, a picture of two people who no longer existed. I took the frame in my hands, feeling the cheap plastic, and threw it into the trash can, the sound of the glass cracking satisfyingly in the quiet room. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a secure line that only Arthur could access. The message was short and brutal. Bella has been admitted to St. Mary's. Renal failure confirmed. She needs a transplant within 72 hours. Lucas has already contacted a broker. The simulation was not just a test, it was a prediction of the immediate future. Lucas wasn't just thinking about it, he was already in motion. The time frame was tight. 72 hours to dismantle a man who had spent 30 years building his ego. I texted back a single word, proceed. I heard the shower stop. And Lucas walked out, a towel wrapped around his waist, looking at me with that same calculating gaze I saw in the simulation. He walked over, kissed my forehead, and told me he loved me more than anything in the world. I looked him dead in the eye and told him I loved him too, and that I would do anything to save him, even give him my heart. He smiled, thinking I was a fool, not knowing that I was referring to the heart I was about to rip out of his chest metaphorically. He went to the bedroom to sleep, exhausted from the neural strain, leaving me alone in the darkness of the living room. I walked to the window, looking out at the city skyline where the Zen medical tower stood like a beacon of my true power. I was done hiding, done playing the role of the submissive wife. The mourning period for my marriage was over, and the era of my reign had begun. I picked up a small vial from my hidden medical kit, a compound that induces symptoms similar to early-stage kidney failure without causing permanent damage, and stared at it. If he wanted a sick wife, I would give him a sick wife, but one that would become his worst nightmare. I swallowed the liquid, feeling the bitter taste coat my throat, accepting the physical discomfort as the cost of admission to this new game. Tomorrow, when the symptoms started, he would think his plan was working. He would think fate was handing him the opportunity on a silver platter. He would rush me to the hospital, his eyes gleaming with greed, only to find that the hospital was my fortress and he was walking into the dungeon. I lay down on the couch, closing my eyes, not to sleep, but to visualize every step of his destruction, savoring the anticipation of the moment he would realize that the kidney he wanted to steal belonged to the woman who owned the knife. The synthetic poison I had swallowed 30 minutes ago began to work with terrifying precision, sending sharp, rhythmic spasms through my lower back that mimicked the onset of acute renal failure perfectly. I curled up on the cold laminate floor of our bathroom, gripping the porcelain rim of the toilet until my knuckles turned white, and let out a moan of pain that I didn't have to fake. It felt as though invisible hands were wringing out my internal organs like a wet rag, a dull and throbbing ache that radiated down to my legs, making me unable to stand. Lucas rushed into the room, his footsteps heavy and urgent. But when he saw me writhing on the floor, the expression on his face wasn't panic. It was a suppressed, sickening delight. He knelt beside me, his hands hovering over my body not to comfort, but to assess the merchandise, checking if the asset was ready for harvest. "Elena, baby, what's wrong?" he asked, his voice dripping with a synthetic sweetness that made me want to vomit more than the drug did. I looked up at him through hazy eyes, playing the part of the terrified, ignorant wife, and whispered that my back hurt, that I couldn't breathe. He didn't call 911. He didn't reach for the phone to call an ambulance. Instead, he smiled, a predatory grin that vanished as quickly as it appeared. "It's okay. I've got you. We need to go to the hospital right now. I know a specialist," he said, helping me up with a grip that was too tight, too possessive. He wasn't taking me to the nearest emergency room. He was taking me to the slaughterhouse he had prepared. He practically dragged me to the car, shoving me into the passenger seat with zero regard for my pain, his mind clearly racing with the timeline he had to meet for Bella. The drive to the hospital was a blur of city lights and Lucas's manic energy. He drove aggressively, cutting off other cars, honking at pedestrians, acting like a worried husband to the outside world, but I could see his knuckles gripping the steering wheel in anticipation. He kept glancing at me, not with concern, but with impatience, checking his watch every 2 minutes as if calculating the freshness of a delivery. "Hang in there. Elena, doctor, Vance is waiting for us. He's the best," Lucas muttered, naming the corrupt nephrologist he had likely bribed with half of his remaining fortune. I leaned my head against the cold window, the vibration of the car exacerbating the nausea, and closed my eyes, visualizing the dossier I had on Dr. Vance. He was a gambler, deep in debt to the wrong people. The perfect pawn for a man like Lucas, who needed a doctor willing to bypass ethics for a suitcase of cash. We pulled up to the emergency entrance of Zen Medical Center, the flagship hospital of my family's empire. The irony tasting bitter on my tongue, Lucas didn't wait for a wheelchair. He pulled me out of the car, parading my suffering condition to the security cameras, establishing his alibi as the doting husband rushing his sick wife to care. We were bypassed through the waiting room, ignoring the angry glares of other patients, and ushered directly into a private VIP suite that Lucas certainly couldn't afford on his current salary. Dr. Vance entered the room moments later, a tall man with nervous eyes and hands that smelled of heavy cologne, trying to mask the scent of tobacco. He didn't look at me. He looked at Lucas. A silent exchange of conspirators acknowledging that the package had been delivered. She's in severe pain. Doctor, it looks like her kidneys are failing. You need to check her immediately, Lucas said, practically dictating the diagnosis before any examination had taken place. Dr. Vance nodded, pulling out a stethoscope that felt like a block of ice against my chest, moving it perfunctorily without actually listening to my heart. We need to run blood work, compatibility tests, just to be safe, Vance said, his voice flat and rehearsed. He wasn't treating a patient. He was inspecting a donor. I let out a whimper, grabbing Lucas's hand, begging him to make the pain stop. Lucas patted my head like one would pet a dog before putting it down. Shh. Elena, the doctor knows best. We have to see if we can fix this, he said, lying through his teeth. A nurse came in with a tray of needles, her face blank. Clearly another employee on Vance's payroll, or just too overworked to notice the sinister undercurrent in the room. The needle pierced my vein with a sharp sting, and I watched my dark red blood flow into the collection tube. The life force that they were so eager to steal. Lucas watched the vial fill up with a hunger that was disturbing. His eyes fixated on the crimson liquid, as if it were liquid gold. Make sure to run the full panel. HLA typing. Cross-matching. Stat. Lucas ordered. Using medical terminology he had clearly looked up on Google the night before. Dr. Vance nodded, taking the vials personally rather than giving them to the nurse. A breach of protocol that screamed foul play. As soon as they left the room to process the results, I dropped the act of the suffering victim for a split second. I reached under the thin hospital pillow where I had hidden my secure smartphone, a prototype device immune to hospital jammers. I sent a single encrypted text to Arthur, who was currently sitting in the server room of the hospital's basement. Code red. Vials labeled Elena Graver. Swap the data. Make me a 100% match. I needed Lucas to believe he had won. I needed him to think the door was open so he would walk right into the trap. If the results came back negative, he might look for another donor for Bella. I needed him to fixate on me. I hid the phone just as the door handle turned, transforming instantly back into the fragile, dying flower. Lucas returned alone, pacing the room like a caged tiger, his phone glued to his ear as he whispered furiously into the receiver. Yes. She's here. Vance is running the tests now. No. She doesn't suspect anything. She thinks it's a sudden infection. He hissed, clearly talking to Bella. I lay still, controlling my breathing, letting the anger simmer deep in my gut, fueling my resolve. Don't worry, baby. You'll have it by tomorrow morning. I promise, he said. And the endearment baby made my skin crawl because he used to call me that. He hung up and walked over to the bed, looking down at me with a mask of tragedy. Elena, I'm so worried. Whatever happens, you know I love you. Right, he said, preparing the emotional manipulation for the next phase. I looked at him, tears welling up in my eyes. Tears of rage that he interpreted as fear. I'm scared. Lucas, I don't want to die, I whispered. He stroked my hair, his touch sending shivers of revulsion down my spine. You won't die. I won't let you. But we might have to make some hard choices, he said, planting the seed. He was setting the stage to convince me that giving up a kidney was the only way to save my own life. A medical lie so absurd, only a desperate monster would invent it. An hour later, Dr. Vance returned, holding a clipboard with a grim expression that couldn't hide the triumph in his eyes. Lucas practically leaped at him. Well, what's the verdict? He demanded. Vance cleared his throat, avoiding my gaze. It's worse than we thought, Mrs. Graver has a rare condition. Her left kidney is necrotic. It's poisoning her blood. We need to remove it immediately to save the right one. Vance lied, reciting the script Lucas must have written. But there's good news, Vance continued, looking at Lucas. Her tissue type is a universal match. Extremely rare, Lucas gasped. A theatrical performance worthy of an award. Oh, thank God. Doctor, do whatever you have to do. Save her. Lucas cried out. Then he turned to me, gripping my shoulders. Elena, did you hear that? You need surgery. Tonight, they have to take the bad kidney out. I looked at them, feigning confusion. But what happens to the kidney? I asked innocently. Lucas froze for a second, then improvised. They dispose of it. Honey, it's medical waste. Unless we can donate it to someone who needs it. Even a damaged kidney might help someone, he stammered, trying to justify the theft. Doctor, Vance said there's a patient. A young woman who matches you perfectly. Since you're losing it anyway, maybe we can save a life. He pushed, the desperation leaking into his voice. The audacity was breathtaking. He wasn't just stealing my organ. He was trying to manipulate me into donating it voluntarily so he wouldn't face legal repercussions later. He wanted my signature on that consent form. I looked at the clipboard Vance was thrusting at me. The words, nephrectomy and donation consent, blurring together. I picked up the pen, my hand trembling. A young woman? I asked softly. Yes. A saint. She does charity work? She's dying. Elena, you could be a hero. Lucas lied, describing the woman who was currently trying to destroy my marriage. I hesitated, letting the pen hover over the paper. Lucas stopped breathing. I could hear his heart pounding in the silence of the room. I slowly lowered the pen and signed my name. Not my real signature, but a slightly altered version that any forensic handwriting expert would later identify as being signed under duress or drug influence. Okay, I whispered. I'll do it. Lucas let out a breath that sounded like a tire deflating. He snatched the clipboard away before I could change my mind. You're doing the right thing. Elena, you're an angel, he said, already turning to Vance to schedule the operating room. He didn't care about the surgery saving me. He cared that he had just secured a $100,000 asset for free. Doctor, Vance hurried out to prep the team, leaving me alone with Lucas again. He was practically vibrating with excitement, texting Bella the good news. I'm going to get some coffee. I'll be right back, he said, unable to contain his energy, needing to go celebrate his victory in the hallway. As soon as the door clicked shut, my face hardened into stone. I sat up, the pain from the drug beginning to fade as its half-life expired, leaving only the cold clarity of revenge. I pulled out my phone again. Arthur had replied, "Consent form received. The digital copy has been flagged in the system. The ethics committee has been anonymously tipped off about a coerced donation in room 402. But I blocked them from intervening for 2 hours. We are letting him proceed to the cutting stage." I typed back, "Good. Let him prep Bella. Let him think he's won. When does the real surgeon arrive?" Arthur's reply was instant. "Doctor. Canis is on standby. He will replace Vance once anesthesia kicks in. Lucas won't know the difference until he wakes up." I deleted the messages and lay back down, staring at the sterile white ceiling tiles. Lucas thought he was the player, but he was just a piece on the board. He was about to wheel his wife into an operating room that she owned, to be cut open by doctors she paid, to save a mistress she had already targeted. The door opened, and 2 orderlies came in to transfer me to the surgical gurney. They were rough, efficient, treating me like a slab of meat. Lucas walked alongside the gurney as we moved down the hallway, holding my hand for the benefit of the nurses. "I'll be right here when you wake up," he promised. A lie so blatant it almost made me laugh. He wouldn't be there. He would be in the recovery room with Bella, waiting for my kidney to be installed in her. We reached the double doors of the operating theater. The sign above read, "Authorized personnel only." Lucas stopped at the line, giving me a final, fake kiss on the forehead. "Good luck, my love," he whispered. I looked at him, etching his face into my memory. This was the last time he would see me as his victim. The next time we met, I would be his judge, jury, and executioner. The doors swung open, and the cold air of the operating room hit me. I was wheeled inside, and the heavy doors slammed shut, separating me from my husband. Dr. Vance was there, scrubbing up, looking eager. "Let's make this quick," he muttered to the anesthesiologist. "The recipient is waiting in OR2. I breathed in the gas mask they placed over my face, counting backward from 10. 10, 9, 8. Goodbye. Lucas. 7, 6. Welcome to hell. The silence in the VIP waiting room was thick and expensive, smelling of fresh lilies and sanitized money, the kind of atmosphere that usually calmed my nerves. But today, it felt electric with the hum of my own impending victory. I paced the length of the Persian rug, checking my Rolex for the 10th time in 5 minutes, calculating the precise moment Dr. 2000. Vance would make the incision into Elena's side to extract the kidney that was worth $500,000 to me. It wasn't just about saving Bella, although her survival was convenient for my public image. It was about the debt collectors who were circling my company like sharks in bloody water, waiting for one missed payment to tear me apart. Bella's father, a senator with deep pockets, had promised to inject capital into my firm the moment his daughter was saved, making Elena's kidney the golden key that would unlock my future. I sat down on the plush leather sofa, pulling out my phone to text Bella a reassurance, telling her to be brave and that her new life was being prepared in the operating room next door. The message failed to send, a red exclamation mark appearing next to the bubble, which was odd considering I was in the flagship hospital of the city with the most advanced network infrastructure in the state. I tried again, tapping the screen with annoyance, assuming it was a glitch. But the signal bar was dead, displaying no service in the corner of the screen. I stood up, irritated, walking toward the large glass doors to step into the hallway where the signal might be better, needing to maintain control over the narrative unfolding in 2 separate operating rooms. I reached for the brushed steel handle of the waiting room door, expecting it to glide open smoothly, but it was locked tight, holding fast against my grip with the stubborn resistance of a vault. I frowned, rattling the handle again, thinking perhaps it was stuck. But then I noticed the electronic panel on the wall blinking a steady, ominous red light instead of the usual welcoming green. I looked through the glass, waving at a passing security guard. A large man with a thick neck and a uniform that looked more like paramilitary gear than hospital security. He stopped, looking at me not with the deference usually reserved for VIP guests, but with the cold, detached stare of a warden looking at an inmate. "Excuse me. The door seems to be jammed. I need to get some air," I said, my voice muffled by the soundproof glass. Raising my voice to be heard, the guard didn't move to open it. Instead, he tapped his earpiece, listened to a voice I couldn't hear, and then spoke through the intercom system. "Mr. Graver, please remain seated. The surgical wing is under a level 3 lockdown due to a sterilization protocol. No one enters or leaves until the cycle is complete." The explanation sounded plausible enough to a layman, but there was something in his tone, a dismissive edge that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "I am Lucas Graver. My wife is in surgery. I need to make a call," I demanded, letting my anger seep into my voice, trying to assert the authority I was used to wielding. "Sit down." "Sir," the guard repeated, turning his back on me and walking away, leaving me staring at his retreating figure with a mix of disbelief and rising panic. I retreated to the sofa, forcing myself to calm down, telling myself that hospitals had bureaucratic glitches all the time and that I shouldn't let my paranoia get the best of me. Just as I sat down, the door on the opposite side of the room, the one leading to the administrative offices, opened with a soft hiss. A woman walked in, not a nurse in scrubs, but a billing administrator in a sharp navy suit, holding a tablet with a stylus poised like a weapon. She didn't smile, didn't offer the usual platitudes about comfort, but marched straight to the coffee table in front of me and placed the tablet down with a heavy thud. "Mr. Graver, we have encountered a significant issue with the admission paperwork for your wife and the recipient. Miss Bella Thorne," she said, her voice crisp and devoid of warmth. I looked at her, annoyed by the interruption. "What issue?" I gave Dr. Vance my insurance information. He said he would handle the expedited processing, I replied, waving my hand dismissively. She tapped the screen, turning it to face me, revealing a billing invoice that was filled with zeros. "Your insurance carrier has flagged the policy as terminated as of midnight last night due to non-payment of premiums. Furthermore, the secondary coverage under Mrs. Graver's name has been frozen by the policyholder for suspicious activity." My heart skipped a beat. Elena had access to those accounts. Had she done this? No. She was unconscious. She was dying on a table right now. It must be a bank error. That is ridiculous. Run it again. I am good for it, I snapped, reaching for my wallet to pull out my black card. The symbol of my invincibility. We did run it. "Mr. Graver." 3 times. "We also attempted to process the pre-authorization hold on your personal credit cards for the out-of-pocket surgical costs," she said, her eyes drilling into mine with a look that screamed deadbeat. "Every single card has been declined. Insufficient funds. Fraud alerts. Frozen assets." The words hit me like physical blows, knocking the wind out of my chest. I snatched the card from my wallet, the Centurion card that had never failed me, and thrust it at her. "Try this one. There is no limit on this card. Do it now," I ordered, my voice cracking slightly. She took the card with 2 fingers, as if it were contaminated, and swiped it through the reader attached to her tablet. The device beeped a harsh, dissonant tone that echoed in the silent room. "Declined," she said, handing it back to me with a sneer. "Code 51. Do not honor. Confiscate card." She didn't confiscate it. but the look on her face said she wanted to cut it in half right there. Sir, Zen Medical is a private facility. We do not operate on charity cases. The combined cost of the nephrectomy and the transplant is $250,000. Payable immediately. I stared at her. The reality of the situation crashing down on me. Elena controlled the money. If the accounts were frozen, it meant someone at the bank knew. Or maybe Elena hadn't paid the bills. No. She was meticulous. This felt targeted. This felt like an attack. I can make a call. My business partner. He will wire the funds. I stammered, my arrogance evaporating. You have 30 minutes to secure the funds, Mr. Graver. Or we will be forced to halt the procedure on the recipient. Your wife's surgery, however, is already underway and cannot be stopped. So you will be liable for those costs regardless, she said, delivering the ultimatum with the cold efficiency of a tax collector. She turned on her heel and walked out, the door locking behind her with a definitive click. I was alone again. But now, the silence was terrifying. I rushed to the landline phone on the side table, snatching up the receiver to call Bella's father. If I told him there was a billing glitch, he would wire the money. He had to. I dialed the number, my fingers trembling. But instead of a dial tone, I heard a recorded voice. External calls are restricted from this extension. Please contact the operator for assistance. I hit 0, desperate to get through to anyone. Operator, a robotic voice answered. Connect me to an outside line. It is an emergency. I yelled. I am sorry, but your room privileges have been suspended pending billing resolution. Goodbye. The line went dead. I slammed the receiver down, the plastic cracking under the force of my rage. I was trapped. No cell service. No landline. Locked doors. My cards were useless. I was a millionaire on paper. But in this room, I was a pauper. I ran to the glass wall that overlooked the surgical hallway, pressing my face against the pane, trying to see into the operating theaters. The blinds on the windows of OR 1 and OR 2, which had been open earlier, were now drawn tight, blocking any view of what was happening inside. Panic began to claw at my throat, a suffocating sensation that made the room feel like it was shrinking. What if Vance had stopped? What if Bella was dying right now because I couldn't swipe a card, or worse? What if Vance was continuing, knowing I couldn't pay, and was planning to hold me hostage afterwards? I banged on the glass, shouting for Dr. Vance, shouting for anyone. Hey, open this door. Do you know who I am? I screamed, my dignity completely abandoned. The security guard from earlier walked by again. He didn't even look at me. He simply stopped, turned his back to the glass, and stood there like a statue, effectively blocking my view of the hallway. It was then that I noticed the small detail on his uniform that I had missed before. It wasn't the standard hospital security badge. It was a pin on his collar. A small, stylized Z intertwined with a serpent. It was the elite private security insignia of the Zen Corporation's Executive Protection Unit. Why were they here? They only guarded the board of directors. A horrible thought began to take root in my mind. A seed of doubt that sprouted into a tree of terror within seconds. The frozen accounts. The canceled insurance. The lockdown. The elite security. This wasn't a bureaucratic error. This was a coordinated strike. But who Elena was unconscious. She was the only one who had access to the family trust. The only one who could wield this kind of power. But I had seen her sedated. I had seen her wheeled away. Unless she wasn't. I backed away from the window, stumbling over the coffee table, my legs hitting the edge of the sofa. I looked up at the television screen mounted on the wall, which had been playing a mute news channel. Suddenly, the channel changed. It didn't switch to another network. It switched to a static feed. And then, a live video stream appeared. It was a view of an operating room. My heart stopped. It was OR1. I could see the team of doctors surrounding the patient. I moved closer, squinting at the grainy image. The patient on the table was covered in blue drapes, only the surgical field exposed. But something was wrong. The doctors weren't operating. They were standing there, arms crossed, waiting. One of the surgeons, the one at the head of the table, turned and looked directly into the camera lens. He was wearing a mask, but his eyes were crinkled in a way that suggested he was smiling. He reached up and slowly pulled down his mask. It wasn't Dr. Vance. It was a man I recognized from magazine covers. A man who was rumored to be the personal physician of the president. Dr. Marcus Kane, the chief of surgery at Zen Medical. Why was he there? Where was Vance? Dr. Kane leaned into the microphone near the camera. Mr. Graver, we are ready to begin, he said, his voice coming through the TV speakers crisp and clear. But there has been a change in the surgical plan. We found that the donor kidney is indeed compatible with a recipient. However, the recipient is not Ms. Bella Thorne. I froze, my blood turning to ice. Who? Who are you talking to? I whispered, though I knew he couldn't hear me. Or could he? The patient has designated a specific recipient for her donation, Kane continued, picking up a clipboard. A Mr. John Doe, a homeless veteran currently in ICU 4 with end-stage renal failure. The transfer is approved. Proceeding with extraction. No, I screamed, lunging at the TV as if I could stop them with my bare hands. Stop. That kidney is mine. It's for Bella. I pounded on the screen, but the image remained, showing them making the incision. They were giving my money, my future, to a homeless man. This was insanity. Vance. Where is Vance? I yelled, looking around the room for a camera. Realizing I was being watched. You can't do this. I have a contract. The door to the waiting room buzzed, the lock disengaging with a loud clack. I spun around, expecting the billing lady or security. But the door opened and a man in a gray suit walked in. He held a briefcase and looked at me with an expression of profound pity. It was a process server. He didn't speak. He simply walked up to me, shoved a thick envelope into my chest, and turned to leave. I grabbed his arm. What is this? Get me out of here, I pleaded. He pulled his arm away, dusting off his sleeve where I had touched him. You have been served. Mr. Graver. Restraining order, divorce papers, and a notice of eviction from the premises. You are trespassing. I looked down at the papers in my hand. The title at the top was bold and black, Elena Vuong versus Lucas Graver. Elena Vuong, not Elena Graver, and then I saw it. The name of the plaintiff's representation. The law offices of Zen Medical Group. My knees gave out, and I collapsed onto the floor, the papers scattering around me like fallen leaves. Vuong. The Vuong family. The founders of Zen Medical. The family that owned half of New York. Elena wasn't an orphan. She was the crown princess of the empire I was trying to rob. The realization hit me harder than any physical blow. I hadn't just kicked a dog. I had walked into the dragon's lair and tried to steal its egg. I looked up at the TV screen. The surgery was proceeding. They were cutting her open. But they weren't stealing from her. She was giving it away. She was giving away the very thing I needed to survive. Just to spite me. And I was locked in a cage of gold and glass, watching my life bleed out on a monitor, unable to do a single thing to stop it. The air in the room felt thin, insufficient to fill my lungs. I crawled toward the door, but the security guard was standing there, blocking the exit. Sir, he said, his voice heavy with mockery. "You look unwell. Perhaps we should admit you. We have a vacancy in the psychiatric ward." The security guard's threat regarding the psychiatric ward hung in the air like a guillotine blade waiting to drop. And I knew with a terrifying certainty that if I allowed myself to be taken behind those padded doors, Lucas Graver would cease to exist. The adrenaline flooded my system, overriding the paralysis of shock with a primal, animalistic need to survive. And my eyes darted to the heavy marble bust of Hippocrates resting on the pedestal beside the door. As the guard stepped forward to restrain me, his hand reaching for the handcuffs on his belt with a confident sneer, I lunged not at him, but at the sculpture, heaving the 20-pound stone with a scream that tore through my throat. I swung it in a clumsy, desperate arc, the cold marble colliding with the guard's temple with a sickening thud. Not enough to kill him, but enough to send him stumbling back into the glass partition. He went down, his radio clattering across the polished floor. And I didn't wait to check his pulse or regret my violence. I scrambled over his legs, my expensive Italian leather shoes slipping on the floor as I burst into the hallway. The alarm didn't sound immediately, giving me a terrifying window of silence as I sprinted down the corridor, the fluorescent lights stretching out above me like a runway to hell. I ran past the nurses' station, their heads turning in slow motion, their eyes wide with judgment and confusion. And in my panicked state, every whisper sounded like they were calling security. Every phone ringing sounded like a police siren coming for me. I needed to get to operating room 2, to grab Bella, to drag her out of this slaughterhouse before they realized my credit cards were dead and decided to evict her mid-surgery. I reached the double doors of the surgical wing, slamming my body weight against them, expecting resistance from electronic locks. But they swung open, revealing a sterile white purgatory that smelled of iodine and death. "Bella," I shouted, my voice cracking and echoing off the tiled walls. But the only answer was the rhythmic beeping of machinery from behind closed doors and the distant hum of ventilation. I counted the numbers on the doors. 1, 2, 3, until I reached the door marked 2, the red light above it dark, signaling that the room was not in use. My stomach dropped, a sensation of freefall that made me nauseous, and I shoved the door open, expecting to see a surgery in progress, expecting to see Vance holding a scalpel over my mistress. The room was empty, stripped bare, the operating table wiped clean and glistening under the harsh lights, with no sign of Bella, no sign of the medical team, just a terrifying vacuum where a life-saving procedure should have been. I spun around, my breath coming in ragged gasps, and saw a scrub nurse standing at the end of the hall, pointing a finger at me, her face twisting into a mask of accusation. "Security," she screamed, her voice piercing the silence. And suddenly the doors at the far end of the corridor burst open, vomiting out a squad of uniformed officers. They weren't hospital security. They were the New York Police Department, their hands resting on their holsters, their faces set in grim lines of duty. I froze, realizing that I had been herded here, that the empty room was the cheese in the mousetrap, and I was the rat that had taken the bait. I turned and ran the other way, toward the emergency stairwell, my lungs burning, my mind fracturing with the realization that Bella wasn't just moved. She had been confiscated, taken away as evidence of my fraud. I burst into the stairwell, the heavy metal door slamming shut behind me, muting the shouts of freeze. And I took the stairs 3 at a time, risking a broken neck to put distance between me and the law. I tumbled out of the service exit into the alleyway, the bitter wind of a New York winter hitting my sweat-soaked shirt like a wall of ice, instantly freezing the moisture on my skin and biting into my bones. I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. I scrambled over dumpsters that smelled of medical waste and rotting garbage, tearing my suit, ruining the silk that cost $3,000, reducing myself to the appearance of the homeless man Elena had just saved. I burst onto the main avenue, the noise of the city assaulting my senses. Taxis honking, people shouting, the relentless churn of capitalism that I was no longer a part of. I looked back at the towering glass facade of Zen Medical, seeing it not as a beacon of healing, but as a monolith of my destruction. The logo at the top glowing like a hateful eye watching my pathetic escape. My phone was gone, dropped somewhere in the stairwell during my flight, and my wallet was useless. A piece of leather filled with plastic that had been deactivated by a single command from my wife. I was shivering violently, not just from the cold, but from the shock of the plummet, the realization that in the span of 2 hours, I had gone from a king to a fugitive. I merged into the crowd on Fifth Avenue, keeping my head down, terrified that every siren I heard was coming for me, that every person looking at their smartphone was reading the news of my downfall. I passed an electronics store, the wall of televisions in the window displaying the evening news, and my blood ran cold as I saw my own face, a picture taken from a gala 2 years ago, smiling and arrogant. The headline scrolling beneath it was not about my business success, but a red ticker that read CEO wanted for questioning an organ trafficking scheme, a charge that carried a mandatory minimum sentence of 20 years. Elena moved fast, faster than the speed of light, weaponizing the media before the police had even cuffed me, ensuring that even if I escaped the law, I would be convicted in the court of public opinion. People on the street stopped, looking at the screen, then looking around, and I pulled my collar up, hiding my face, shrinking into the shadows of the scaffolding. I had to find Bella. She was the only one who could clear me, or blame me. But I didn't even know where she was. I didn't even know if she was still alive. I found a payphone, a relic in the city that smelled of urine and desperation, and fumbled in my pocket for the loose change I kept for tolls. Finding a single quarter that felt like the last coin on earth, I dialed Bella's private number, the one only I knew, my hand shaking so hard I misdialed the first time, wasting precious seconds while looking over my shoulder for the police. It rang once, twice, 3 times, and then someone picked up, but it wasn't Bella's voice. It was a man's voice, calm and professional. "This is Detective Miller, NYPD." "Who is this?" the voice asked, and I slammed the receiver down as if it had burned my ear, the metallic clang echoing in the booth. They had her phone, which meant they had her. And if Bella was in custody, she would trade me in a heartbeat to save her own skin. I stumbled back into the night, the snow beginning to fall, covering the city in a white shroud, covering my tracks, or perhaps preparing my grave. I had nowhere to go, no money, no allies, and the woman I tried to kill was currently the most powerful person in the city. I needed shelter. I needed a place to think. So I headed toward the only place I had left, my company headquarters in the financial district, praying that my access badge still worked. The walk was a torture, miles of freezing cold that turned my feet numb. But fear kept me moving one step after another. I arrived at the Graver Inc. building an hour later, staying in the shadows, looking at the lobby through the revolving doors. There were lights on, which was strange for this hour, and I saw men in windbreakers moving around the reception desk, carrying boxes. I squinted, reading the letters on the back of their jackets. FBI. 3 letters that spelled the end of my corporate existence. They were raiding my office, seizing my servers, taking every file that could prove my embezzlement and the illegal loans I took to fund Bella's lifestyle. I backed away into the darkness, realizing that the net hadn't just closed. It had been welded shut around me. I was a ghost haunting my own life, watching strangers dismantle everything I built. I sat down on a bench in a small park, the wood hard and cold, and put my head in my hands, trying to stop the world from spinning. A homeless man pushed a cart past me, looking at me with eyes that held no judgment, only a weary recognition of another soul hitting rock bottom. He stopped, pulling a crumpled newspaper from his cart, and offered it to me. Perhaps thinking I needed it for warmth, I took it, staring at the front page, where a picture of Elena leaving the hospital was already printed, looking like a saint in white, surrounded by reporters. The caption read, "Heiress Elena Vuong donates kidney to veteran. Exposes corruption." She looked beautiful, strong, and completely untouchable. I looked at my hands, stained with the grime of the city, shaking uncontrollably. I had underestimated her. I had thought she was a sheep, but she was the shepherd, and she had just fed me to the wolves. I crumpled the paper, throwing it into the snow, and stood up. I couldn't stay here. I had one card left to play: the underworld. The loan sharks I had borrowed from to pay Vance. They wouldn't care about the FBI. They only cared about their money. If I could convince them to help me, maybe, just maybe, I could get out of the country. The smell of the underground gambling den was a suffocating mix of expensive Cuban cigars and cheap desperation. A scent that used to make me feel powerful when I came here to blow $10,000 on a single hand of poker. But tonight it smelled like my own funeral. I stood shivering in the heavy velvet entryway of the Velvet Room, a private club in Little Italy that served as the front for the Vargos crime syndicate. My hands tucked deep into the pockets of my ruined suit to hide their uncontrollable trembling. The bouncer, a mountain of muscle named Tiny, who had once parked my Porsche with a smile, looked at me now with eyes that were flat and dead, scanning my disheveled hair and the mud on my shoes with clinical disdain. "Mr. Graver, you look like you walked through a sewer," Tiny said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated in my chest. I tried to summon the ghost of my former arrogance, straightening my spine and forcing a smile that felt like cracking plaster. "Rough night, Tiny. Just a little misunderstanding with the authorities. I need to see Mr. Vargos. Immediately. It is a matter of urgent business," I said, my voice sounding thin and reedy in the opulent room. Tiny didn't move for a long moment, letting me sweat under the crystal chandelier, before he pressed a finger to his earpiece and whispered something I couldn't catch. He stepped aside, not with respect, but with the motion of a man opening a cage door for an animal. "He is in the back. Don't waste his time. Time is money. And you look broke." I walked through the main floor, keeping my head down to avoid the gaze of the high rollers at the baccarat tables, men who were currently betting my annual salary on the turn of a card. I reached the heavy oak door at the back, the one marked private, and pushed it open, stepping into an office that was silent and cold as a tomb. Mr. Vargos sat behind a massive mahogany desk, cutting into a rare steak with surgical precision, the blood from the meat pooling on the white porcelain plate like a crimson omen. He didn't look up as I entered, continuing to slice the meat into perfect squares, the sound of the knife scraping against the plate, the only noise in the room. "Lucas, you are late with my interest payment," Vargo said, popping a piece of steak into his mouth and chewing slowly. I approached the desk, my legs feeling like they were made of lead. "Mr. Vargos, I know. I had a liquidity issue. My accounts are temporarily frozen. A clerical error by the bank." I lied, the words tumbling out of my mouth in a rush. "I need a bridge loan. Just $50,000 to clear things up. I will pay you double next week. Triple. I swear on my mother's grave. Vargo stopped chewing. He placed his knife and fork down, picked up a linen napkin, and wiped his mouth. He looked at me then, his eyes black and bottomless, devoid of any human empathy. Your mother is alive, Lucas. She lives in Florida, and your accounts aren't frozen. They are seized. Vargos picked up a remote control and clicked a button, turning on the large flat-screen TV mounted on the wall behind him. The news channel was playing a special report. The headline screaming in bold yellow letters, "Fugitive CEO, the fall of Lucas Graver." The anchor was detailing the FBI raid on my offices, the seizure of my assets, and the statement from Zen Medical exposing my attempt to traffic human organs. You are famous, Lucas, but not in the way that makes money, Vargo said, his voice smooth and terrifyingly calm. You owe me $200,000, plus the vigorish. That brings the total to $250,000, payable today. I swallowed hard, my throat dry as sandpaper. I can get it. I have offshore accounts, hidden assets. I just need to get out of the city. If you lend me the cash, I can access them, I pleaded, inventing money that didn't exist. Vargos laughed, a dry, barking sound that had no humor in it. You are lying to a shark. Lucas, we ran a credit check on you 10 minutes ago. You are insolvent. You are what we in the business call a toxic asset. And when an asset turns toxic, we don't invest more capital. We liquidate. He pressed a button on his intercom. Bring in the auditor. The door behind me opened, and 2 men walked in. They weren't wearing suits. They were wearing white lab coats and blue latex gloves, carrying a silver medical case that looked horrifyingly familiar. They didn't look like doctors. They looked like mechanics coming to strip a car for parts. I backed away, bumping into the leather chair, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. What is this? Who are these men? I stammered, pointing a shaking finger at them. Vargo stood up, walking around the desk to lean against the front, crossing his arms over his chest. You tried to steal a kidney from your wife to pay your debts. It was a solid business plan. Actually, I admire the ruthlessness, Vargo said, nodding appreciatively. But you failed. And now, the debt remains. Since you have no cash, no property, and no stocks, we have to look at your physical inventory. He gestured to my body with a casual wave of his hand. You are a healthy male, 30 years old, non-smoker, moderate drinker. Your liver is prime real estate. Your corneas, your bone marrow, and of course, 2 functioning kidneys. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. He wasn't going to kill me. He was going to dismantle me. I was the payment. No, you can't do this. I am a human being, I screamed, backing toward the door. But the 2 men in white coats moved with terrifying speed, blocking my exit. I am not a car. You can't just part me out, Vargo sighed, looking disappointed. Lucas, please, don't be emotional. This is purely transactional. You borrowed money. You signed a collateral agreement. Paragraph 4. Section C. In the event of default, the lender reserves the right to seize any and all assets of the borrower to satisfy the debt. You didn't read the fine print, did you? He snapped his fingers, and the 2 men lunged at me. I tried to fight, swinging my fists wildly, but I was weak from the cold and the fear. One of them grabbed my arm, twisting it behind my back with a professional efficiency that sent a bolt of agony shooting up to my shoulder. The other one pulled out a syringe from the silver case, the needle glinting under the office lights. Don't struggle. It damages the merchandise. Stress hormones ruin the meat. the man with the syringe whispered, his voice clinical and detached. I felt the sharp prick in my neck, and a cold fire began to spread through my veins. Much faster and more potent than the anesthesia at the hospital. My legs gave out, and they dragged me toward a hidden door in the bookshelf that I hadn't noticed before. It slid open to reveal not a dark dungeon, but a sterile, fully equipped surgical suite, gleaming with stainless steel and high-tech monitors. It looked exactly like the one I had tried to send Elena into. The irony was a bitter taste in my mouth as my vision began to blur. Please. I have information. I know secrets about Zen Medical. I can help you blackmail Elena. I slurred, trying to trade the only thing I had left. My betrayal. Vargos followed us into the room, looking at the monitors as the men hoisted me onto the operating table. Elena Vuong is a very powerful woman. Lucas. In fact, she is a silent investor in many ventures, including this one, Vargos said, dropping the bombshell that shattered the last of my sanity. She didn't ask for you to be killed. She simply called in your debt. She bought your promissory note an hour ago. Technically, you don't owe me anything anymore. You belong to her. I stared up at the blinding surgical lights, the same lights from my nightmare, realizing that the loop had closed. I wasn't just a victim of the mob. I was a victim of my wife's hostile takeover. Vargos leaned over me, his face swimming in my fading vision. She left specific instructions for the restructuring of your assets, he said, checking the clipboard the auditor handed him. We are to extract one kidney, to be donated to the same homeless veteran you tried to rob. A poetic justice, don't you think? He laughed, and the sound echoed in my ears as the darkness began to close in. I wanted to scream, to beg, to promise that I would love her, that I would be a good husband. But my tongue was heavy, paralyzed by the drug. I felt the cold antiseptic being swabbed onto my side, the same spot where I had planned to cut her. The fear was a cold knot in my stomach. Not because I was going to die, but because I was going to live. I was going to wake up less than I was, marked forever by the woman I thought was weak. The surgeon raised the scalpel, and for a second, I thought I saw Elena's face behind his mask, watching me with those cold, judging eyes. Proceed with liquidation, Vargos ordered. The last thing I felt was the pressure of the blade, and the crushing weight of absolute, total regret. I woke up not to the sound of my alarm playing classical music or the smell of freshly brewed espresso, but to the overwhelming, acidic stench of rotting vegetables and stale beer that filled my nose and lungs, choking me into consciousness. I tried to inhale, to cough out the bile rising in my throat, but the moment my diaphragm contracted, a blinding white-hot agony exploded in my lower right side, tearing a scream from my lips that emerged only as a dry, ragged gasp. I was lying on something hard and uneven, surrounded by darkness, and as my eyes adjusted to the gloom, I realized I was curled up in a fetal position inside a metal industrial dumpster, nestled among black garbage bags like a piece of discarded refuse. The cold New York wind whipped through the gaps in the metal container, biting at my exposed skin. And I realized with a fresh wave of horror that I was naked from the waist up, my expensive shirt gone, replaced by crude bandages wrapped tightly around my midsection. I tried to sit up, but the pain was absolute, a physical weight that pinned me down, sending shockwaves through my nervous system that made my vision blur with spots of light. I reached down with a trembling hand, my fingers brushing against the rough gauze, and felt the unmistakable ridge of sutures beneath the fabric. A long, jagged line where my skin had been sliced open and sewn back together like an old rag doll. They had done it. They had actually done it. The realization washed over me colder than the winter air, freezing the blood in my veins as I understood that Vargos wasn't bluffing, that Elena hadn't interceded to save me, but to harvest me. I was lighter now, physically lighter by a few ounces, missing a vital part of myself that had been stolen in a sterile room while I lay helpless and drugged. I grit my teeth, forcing myself to move despite the agony, pushing aside a bag that smelled of fish to create space, needing to get out of this coffin of trash before the garbage truck came to compact me along with the rest of the city's waste. I grabbed the rim of the dumpster, my muscles screaming in protest, and hauled myself up, swinging my legs over the side and tumbling onto the asphalt of the alleyway, landing hard on my knees. The impact sent another jolt of pain through my side that nearly made me black out, leaving me gasping on the wet pavement, staring at a puddle of dirty water that reflected the broken ruin of a man who used to be a CEO. I looked down at my pants, the only clothing I had left, and saw something pinned to the waistband, a piece of paper fluttering in the wind. I pulled it loose, my fingers stiff and clumsy, and held it up to the dim light of the street lamp at the end of the alley. It was a receipt, a standard, thermal-printed receipt like you would get from a grocery store. But the logo at the top wasn't a supermarket. It was the crest of the Vargos Syndicate. The itemization was brutal in its simplicity. 1 male kidney. Left side. Market value $50,000. Processing fee $10,000. Remaining debt 0. Status paid in full. At the bottom, in handwriting that I recognized with a chill that went deeper than the bone, were the words, "Thank you for your donation. E.V." Elena. She had turned my mutilation into a transaction, reducing my body to a ledger entry, verifying that I was worth more to her in pieces than I was as a whole man. I crumpled the paper in my fist, wanting to roar with rage. But I had no strength left, only a hollow, gnawing emptiness where my arrogance used to be. I needed help. I needed a doctor, a lawyer, anyone. I used the brick wall to pull myself upright, my legs shaking uncontrollably, and stumbled toward the mouth of the alley, emerging onto a side street in the meatpacking district. It was early morning. The city was just waking up. Delivery trucks rumbling by, pedestrians walking briskly with their heads down, ignoring the shirtless, bloodied man stumbling out of the shadows. I walked like a zombie, one hand clutching my side to hold my insides together, the other reaching out to passers-by who recoiled from me as if I were a leper. "Help me. Call the police," I rasped, my voice a croak that barely carried over the noise of traffic. A woman in a business suit saw me and crossed the street immediately, clutching her purse tighter, her face twisted in disgust. To them, I wasn't Lucas Graver, the tycoon. I was just another junkie, another piece of human debris littering their clean streets. I caught my reflection in the window of a high-end boutique, seeing a gaunt, pale creature with sunken eyes and dried blood smeared across his chest, a monster that bore no resemblance to the man who had worn $3,000 suits. I leaned against the glass, leaving a greasy smear, and stared at the television screen inside the store, which was broadcasting the morning news. The chyron at the bottom of the screen caught my eye, freezing me in place despite the cold. Miracle at Zen Medical, homeless veteran receives life-saving transplant from anonymous donor. The screen cut to footage of a press conference. There was Elena, standing at a podium, looking radiant in a white dress that symbolized purity and grace, flanked by Dr. Kane and a man in a wheelchair who looked overwhelmed with gratitude. "We believe that healthcare is a human right," Elena was saying, her voice clear and strong, projecting an image of absolute benevolence. "When we found a matching organ that was available, we didn't hesitate. We prioritized a life that society had forgotten over profit." The reporters flashed their cameras, blinding her in a sea of adoration. I stared at the man in the wheelchair, the homeless veteran I had tried to rob, the man who was now living with my kidney inside him. Elena hadn't just taken it, she had given it to the very person I despised, creating a narrative where she was the savior and I was the anonymous, non-existent donor. I wasn't just erased from the narrative. My body was being used to fuel her sainthood. I slid down the glass, sitting on the cold sidewalk, laughing a dry, hysterical laugh that sounded like sobbing. She had played the ultimate joke. She had forced me to be charitable. Hey, you can't sit here. You're scaring the customers? A voice barked from above me. I looked up to see a security guard standing there. A large man with a thick neck, holding a baton. It wasn't the Zen security, just a shop guard. But the disdain was the same. Get moving. Trash. Go find a shelter, he sneered, nudging my boot with his heavy shoe. I looked at him, a spark of my old self igniting for a brief second. Do you know who I am? I am Lucas Graver. I own half this block. I spat, trying to sound authoritative, but it came out as the ramblings of a madman. The guard laughed. A cruel, barking sound. Yeah. And I'm the King of England. Move it. Junkie. Before I call the cops. The cops. The word was a bucket of ice water. I was a fugitive. If the police came, they wouldn't take me to a hospital. They would take me to a cell. And with my untreated wound. A cell meant infection and death. I struggled to my feet, gritting my teeth against the tearing pain in my side, and shuffled away. Defeated by a man who made minimum wage, I needed to find Bella. She was the only wild card left. If she was in custody, maybe she hadn't talked yet. Maybe she still loved me. I found a discarded newspaper in a trash can on the corner, flipping through the pages with frantic fingers until I found the crime section. And there she was, a photo of Bella being led out of the precinct in handcuffs, looking tearful and fragile. But the headline shattered my last hope. Model confesses, Lucas forced me to participate in organ scheme. The article detailed her statement, claiming that I was an abusive mastermind who had manipulated her, that she never wanted the kidney, that she was a victim of my controlling nature. She had thrown me to the wolves to cut a deal. She was likely already out on bail, staying in one of her father's safe houses. While I was bleeding in the street, I dropped the paper, watching it blow away into the gutter. Everyone I had used had turned on me. Everyone I had stepped on was now standing on my neck. The pain in my side was changing, shifting from a sharp agony to a dull, throbbing heat that suggested the beginning of an infection. I was burning up, sweat mingling with the grime on my forehead. I had no money, no ID, no friends, and my body was failing. I looked up at the towering skyscrapers of Manhattan, the glass canyons where I used to soar like an eagle, and realized I was now just a rat scurrying at the bottom. I stumbled toward a subway entrance, seeking the warmth of the underground, the only place left for people like me. As I descended the stairs, the smell of urine and old brakes rising to meet me. I brushed past a businessman rushing up the steps, talking on his phone. He bumped into me, knocking me against the railing. Watch it. Bum, he snapped, dusting off his suit jacket where he had touched me. I looked at his suit, a cheap off-the-rack polyester blend, and realized with a jolt that I used to fire men for wearing suits like that. Now, he was the master, and I was the invisible stain on his morning commute. I sat down on the bottom step, pulling my knees to my chest, trying to preserve the little body heat I had left. A busker was playing a violin further down the platform, a melancholic tune that echoed off the tiled walls. I listened to the music, closing my eyes, and for a moment, I was back in the simulation, back in the dream where I made the choice to kill my wife. If I had chosen differently, If I had chosen to save her, would I be here now, or was I always destined for this? The question swirled in my fevered brain. Unanswered. I reached into my pocket, my fingers brushing against the crumpled receipt from Vargos. I pulled it out, smoothing it on my knee. Remaining debt 0. It was the only truthful thing anyone had said to me in days. I had paid my debt to the underworld. But my debt to Elena was apparently eternal. I leaned my head back against the cold tiles, closing my eyes, and waited for the darkness to take me, wondering if this time I would wake up at all, or if this was finally the end of the simulation called my life. The darkness that had swallowed me in the subway station receded slowly, replaced not by the gritty gray of the underground or the harsh glare of a police interrogation room, but by a soft, diffused white light that felt almost celestial against my tired eyes. I blinked, trying to clear the fog from my brain, and realized I was lying on a mattress that felt like a cloud, wrapped in linens that smelled of expensive lavender detergent and absolute cleanliness. For a fleeting, delirious moment, I thought I had died and gone to heaven. Or perhaps the simulation had finally ended and I was back in my penthouse bed. The nightmare of the last few days, nothing more than a bad reaction to sleeping pills. I tried to sit up, expecting the sharp agony in my side to double me over. But there was only a dull, distant ache, muffled by a heavy blanket of painkillers that made my limbs feel like they were floating in warm water. I looked down at my chest, expecting to see the dirty bandages and the grime of the dumpster. But instead, I was wearing a crisp, pale blue pajama set made of soft cotton. My hands were clean, the dirt scrubbed from under my fingernails, and the IV line taped to the back of my hand was feeding clear fluid into my veins with a rhythmic, reassuring drip. I let out a sigh of relief that shook my entire body, tears pricking at the corners of my eyes as the realization washed over me that I had been saved. Someone had found me. Someone had seen a human being beneath the filth and brought me to a private hospital. I scanned the room, noting the lack of medical machinery usually found in an ICU. There were no beeping heart monitors, no tangled wires, just a sleek, minimalist room with rounded corners and furniture bolted securely to the floor. A large window on the far wall looked out onto a serene garden filled with manicured hedges and weeping willows, bathing the room in natural light. It looked like a 5-star wellness retreat, the kind Bella used to go to for detox after Fashion Week. I swung my legs over the edge of the bed, feeling unsteady but functional, and stood up, my bare feet sinking into the plush carpet. I needed to find a phone. I needed to call a lawyer. Now that I was clean and medicated, I could build a case. I could claim I was kidnapped. I could sue Vargos. I could sue Elena. The hope was a dangerous drug, surging through me faster than the morphine. I walked toward the heavy oak door, reaching for the handle with a newfound determination. It turned easily, unlike the door at the hospital, and I stepped out into a wide, carpeted hallway painted in soothing pastel tones. Soft classical music played from hidden speakers, a stark contrast to the chaotic noise of the city streets I had just escaped. A nurse in blue scrubs was walking toward me, holding a clipboard. She didn't look alarmed. She smiled. A warm, professional smile that put me at ease. "Mr. Graver, you're awake. We were worried you might sleep through lunch," she said, her voice gentle and melodic. "Where am I? Who brought me here?" I asked, leaning against the wall for support, trying to sound authoritative despite my pajamas. "You are at Serenity Hill, Mr. Graver. It is a private residential facility. You were brought in last night by emergency transport. You were in very bad shape," she explained, checking something on her tablet. Serenity Hill. The name sounded familiar. Vague, but expensive. I need a phone. I need to contact my attorney immediately. And I want to speak to the chief physician about my injury, I said, gesturing to my side. The nurse's smile didn't falter, but there was a subtle shift in her eyes. A flicker of pity that I didn't like. Of course. Lucas, we can discuss all of that in your evaluation. Doctor, Miles is waiting for you in the solarium. If you'll just follow me, she said, using my first name with a familiarity that felt condescending. I followed her, my suspicion beginning to prickle at the back of my neck. We passed other guests in the hallway, men and women in similar pajamas, shuffling aimlessly or staring out windows with vacant expressions. One man was muttering to himself about the stock market crashing, his hands moving as if he were typing on an invisible keyboard. A chill ran down my spine. This wasn't a standard hospital. We entered the solarium, a beautiful glass-walled room filled with plants. A man in a white coat sat at a small round table, reading a file. He looked up as I entered, removing his glasses. Ah. Lucas, please. Have a seat. How is the pain today? Doctor, Miles asked, gesturing to the chair opposite him. I didn't sit. I stood my ground, gripping the back of the chair. I want to know who authorized my admission. I didn't sign anything. This is kidnapping, I stated, my voice rising. Doctor, Miles sighed, closing the file. Lucas, you were found unconscious in a subway station, suffering from sepsis and a self-inflicted surgical wound. You were a danger to yourself. Under New York state law, that grants us the authority to hold you for a 72-hour observation period, he said calmly. Self-inflicted. Are you insane? I was attacked. The mafia stole my kidney. My wife, Elena Vuong. She paid them to do it. She is the one you should be arresting, I shouted, pointing a finger at him. Doctor, Miles didn't look shocked. He didn't look outraged. He simply picked up his pen and wrote a note in the file. I leaned over to see what he wrote. Patient exhibits paranoid delusions. Persecution complex regarding spouse. Elaborate conspiracy theories involving organized crime. Stop writing that. It is the truth. Look at the wound. Look at the scar. I screamed, tearing open my pajama top to reveal the fresh sutures on my side. Does this look self-inflicted to you? Who operates on themselves? Doctor. Miles looked at the wound with a clinical detachment. Lucas, we found the receipt in your pocket. It was a delusional artifact. You likely paid a back-alley butcher to remove it because you believed you needed to sell it. It is a common symptom of financial psychosis. When a man loses his fortune, he sometimes feels he must sell parts of himself to survive. It is a tragic manifestation of grief, he explained, twisting my reality into a textbook diagnosis. No. The receipt was from Vargos. It had Elena's initials on it. I stammered, realizing how crazy I sounded. Vargos isn't real. Lucas, he is a projection of your fear. And Elena, well, we have spoken to your wife. She is very concerned about you. Doctor, Miles said softly. The mention of her name made my blood run cold. You spoke to her. She is the one doing this. You have to believe me. She owns this place. Doesn't she? I whispered, the realization hitting me. Zen Medical. Serenity Hill. It was all part of the same empire. She is on her way here now to discuss your long-term care plan. Doctor, Miles said, checking his watch. Long-term? No. I am leaving. Now, I said, turning to bolt for the door. But two large orderlies were already blocking the exit. They were the same size as the bouncer at the club, their faces impassive. I backed away, looking for another way out. But the glass walls were reinforced. the garden beyond just a pretty cage. I am not crazy. I am Lucas Graver. I am a CEO. I yelled, grabbing a heavy vase from a side table, brandishing it like a weapon. Stay back. I will sue you all. I will burn this place to the ground. Doctor. Miles shook his head sadly. Acute aggression. Threat to others. Code violet. He spoke into a small microphone on his lapel. The orderlies moved in. Fast and efficient. One of them grabbed my arm, twisting the wrist that held the vase until I dropped it with a crash. The other wrapped his arm around my neck in a chokehold that didn't cut off my air, but controlled my movement completely. I struggled, kicking and screaming, verifying every single note. Doctor. Miles had written about my instability. Let me go. She stole my life. She stole my kidney. I howled, sounding exactly like the madman they wanted me to be. The door opened again, and the struggle stopped. The orderlies held me firm, but turned me to face the entrance. Elena walked in. She wasn't wearing the glamorous dress from the press conference. She was wearing a modest, dark suit, her hair pulled back in a severe bun. Clutching a handkerchief, she looked like the picture of a grieving, worried wife. She looked at me, her eyes welling with fake tears, and rushed forward, stopping just out of reach. Oh, Lucas, look at you, my poor darling, she sobbed, her voice trembling. Elena, tell them what you did, I begged, thinking maybe, just maybe, she would drop the act here in private. She looked at Dr. Miles. Doctor, is it true? Did he sell his kidney for gambling money? She asked, her voice thick with heartbreak. I tried to give him everything. I paid off his debts. But he just kept spiraling. I stared at her, my jaw dropping. She was rewriting history in real time. You bought the debt. You ordered the surgery. You are a monster, I hissed. Elena flinched as if I had hit her. See. Doctor, he hates me. He blames me for his failures. He thinks I am some kind of mastermind. She wept into her handkerchief. Doctor? Miles nodded sympathetically, placing a hand on her shoulder. It is classic projection. Mrs. Graver. He cannot accept that he destroyed his own life. So he invented a villain. You are the closest target. He turned his gaze back to me, his eyes hard. Lucas, your wife has signed the papers for your involuntary commitment. Given the severity of your self-harm and your detachment from reality, the state has granted her full guardianship over your person and your remaining assets. Guardianship. The word was a final nail in my coffin. It meant I had no legal rights. I couldn't hire a lawyer. I couldn't access money. I couldn't even choose what I ate for dinner. I was legally a child, and she was the abusive parent. You can't do this. I am sane. Test me. Put me on a lie detector, I pleaded, sinking to my knees as the orderlies forced me down. Elena walked closer, crouching down so her face was level with mine. The tears vanished instantly, replaced by a cold, glittering amusement that only I could see. She leaned in close, her breath warm against my ear, smelling of peppermint. You wanted to live off me. Lucas, you wanted to be taken care of. Well, now I am taking care of you, she whispered, her voice low enough that the doctor couldn't hear. You will have a warm bed, 3 meals a day, and the best doctors my money can buy. You will never have to worry about stock prices or debts again. Isn't that what you wanted? A life of leisure. She pulled back, patting my cheek with a mock tenderness. You stole my kidney, I whispered. Broken, she smiled. A small, terrifying curve of her lips, and I gave it to someone who deserved it. Think of it as your rent payment for living here. She stood up, smoothing her skirt. Doctor, please make sure he is comfortable. He seems very agitated. Perhaps a sedative, she suggested. Doctor? Miles nodded. Of course. Nurse. 50 milligrams of thorazine. An orderly pulled out a syringe. I tried to scramble backward, but they pinned me to the expensive Persian rug. No. No drugs. I need to think. I screamed. But the needle pierced the skin of my thigh, going through the fabric of the pajamas. The cold liquid burned as it entered my muscle, a chemical shroud coming to smother my mind. Elena stood over me, watching the light fade from my eyes. Goodbye. Lucas, get some rest. You have a long life ahead of you here, she said. The last thing I saw before the darkness took me again was her turning to the doctor, discussing a donation to the hospital wing in my name. I opened my mouth to scream the truth one last time, to tell them she was the devil. But my tongue was heavy, and all that came out was a slur. She. Doctor. Miles shook his head. Poor man. He is completely lost in his fantasy. The world went black, and the sound of the heavy security door clicking shut was the sound of my life ending. Not with a bang, but with a diagnosis. The seasons had changed 4 times since the heavy steel doors of Serenity Hill clicked shut behind me, marking the passage of 365 days of medicated peace. I sat on the wrought iron bench in the center of the asylum's garden, watching a single red maple leaf detach itself from a branch and drift slowly down to the manicured grass. A silent metaphor for my own life. The heavy sedation of the first few months had been reduced, leaving me with a mind that was no longer foggy, but crystal clear. A clarity that was far more painful than the madness they accused me of. I was calm now. A model patient who took his pills without complaint, who attended group therapy, and who smiled politely at the doctors who wrote notes about my remarkable recovery. I looked down at my hands, resting on the knees of my beige slacks. Hands that used to sign million-dollar contracts, but now only held a plastic cup of water or a gardening trowel. The anger that had fueled me in the beginning. The rage against Elena, against Vargos, against the world, had burned itself out, leaving behind only a pile of cold, gray ash that tasted like absolute regret. I touched the scar on my left side through my shirt, the phantom ache of the missing kidney serving as a daily reminder of the price of greed. I knew now that Vargos hadn't stolen it. I had given it away, piece by piece. Every time I chose money over love. Every time I chose Bella over Elena. Today was a special day, although no one on the staff knew it. And there was no celebration planned in the communal dining hall. It was our 4th wedding anniversary. I remembered the day we got married at the city hall. Elena wearing a simple white dress she bought at a thrift store for $20. Holding a bouquet of wildflowers I had picked from a park because I was too cheap to buy roses. I remembered the way she looked at me then, with eyes full of hope and adoration, believing that we were a team against the world. 2 poor souls climbing the mountain together. I closed my eyes, letting the memory wash over me. And for the first time in a year, I didn't see the heiress of Zen Medical or the vengeful demon who locked me up. I saw the girl who used to rub my back when I came home tired. The girl who learned to cook my favorite pasta dish, even though she hated garlic. I had that girl in the palm of my hand, a diamond wrapped in rags, and I had thrown her into the trash to chase a piece of glittering glass named Bella. The realization was a physical weight in my chest, heavier than the marble bust I had thrown at the guard, crushing the air from my lungs. I wasn't a victim of a conspiracy. I was the architect of my own hell. Hello, Lucas. The voice was soft, carried on the wind. But it stopped my heart in my chest. I opened my eyes and stood up slowly. turning to face the path that led from the main building. Elena stood there, framed by the autumn trees, looking more beautiful than any memory I possessed. She wasn't wearing the severe suit from the day of my commitment, nor the rags of our marriage. She wore a cream-colored coat that looked like it cost more than the house I grew up in, her hair falling in loose waves around her shoulders. She didn't have security guards with her. No orderlies to restrain me. Just a simple leather portfolio clutched in her gloved hand. She looked at me, and I braced myself for the cold hatred I expected, for the mockery that usually danced in her eyes. But there was none of that. Her gaze was calm, almost indifferent, like a traveler looking at a landmark they had visited a long time ago and no longer found interesting. "Elena, you came," I whispered, my voice rusty from disuse. I didn't move toward her. I knew my place now. I was the inmate. She was the warden. "Happy anniversary," she said. But the words held no sarcasm, only a factual acknowledgement of the date. She walked over to the bench and sat down, leaving a respectful distance between us, gesturing for me to join her. I sat, keeping my hands folded in my lap to hide their trembling. "You look well, Lucas. Doctor, Miles tells me you have made great progress. You have accepted your reality," she said, opening the portfolio on her lap. "I have. I know now that I was sick. Greed is a sickness, isn't it?" I said, looking at her profile, aching to reach out and touch her, but knowing I had lost that right forever. I thought I needed to conquer the world to be happy. I didn't realize I already had the world in my apartment in Queens. Elena paused, her hand hovering over the papers. She turned to look at me, searching my face for any sign of manipulation, but finding only the naked truth of a broken man. "It took you losing everything to see that. It is a pity," she said softly. She pulled a document from the folder and placed it on the bench between us. It was a thick stack of papers, bound with a blue cover. "The guardianship period is over, Lucas, and so is our marriage. These are the divorce papers, and a release form for your discharge from Serenity Hill." I stared at the papers, feeling a wave of panic. Freedom. I didn't want freedom. Freedom meant going out into a world where I was nothing. Freedom meant facing the void without her. "You are releasing me?" I asked, my voice cracking. "Why? You could keep me here forever." Elena looked out at the garden, watching a bird peck at the ground. "Because you are of no use to me anymore, Lucas. During the last year, as your legal guardian, I liquidated your remaining assets to pay off your debts to the company. I transferred your shares. I sanitized the brand. You are clean now. You owe nothing. And you own nothing." She spoke of stripping me bare with the tone of someone discussing the weather. "You are free to go. I have even set up a small trust for you, enough to rent a small apartment, buy food, a quiet life. The life you pretended to have when we met." The irony was sharp enough to draw blood. She was condemning me to the very life I had tried to escape. But this time, I would be living it alone, knowing exactly what I had lost. I picked up the pen she offered, a heavy Mont Blanc that felt cold against my skin. I didn't read the terms. I didn't care about the alimony or the non-disclosure agreements. I turned to the signature page, ready to sign away the last connection I had to her. But before the nib touched the paper, I stopped. I had to know. One question had been burning in my mind for 365 nights. "Elena," I said, looking up at her. "The simulation, that night, if I had chosen differently, if I had told the doctor to save you and the baby, would this be happening?" Elena went still. The wind rustled the leaves around us, the only sound in the heavy silence. She turned to me, and for a brief second, the mask slipped. I saw a flash of profound sadness in her eyes. a glimpse of the woman who had wanted to be loved. "If you had chosen me," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "If you had chosen me, Lucas, you would have woken up the next morning as the co-owner of Zen Medical. We would have ruled the city together. I would have given you the world on a silver platter." The words hit me like a physical blow, knocking the breath out of me. It wasn't just about love. I had failed the ultimate test of character. I had traded a diamond mountain for a handful of dirt because I was too blind to see the difference. Tears welled up in my eyes, hot and stinging, spilling over onto my cheeks without my permission. "I loved you," I choked out, a lie that had become the truth too late. "I loved you, but I loved myself more, and now I hate myself." Elena watched me cry, her expression softening into something like pity. The baby wasn't real. "Lucas, I was never pregnant. But the love was real. Once." She stood up, smoothing her coat, signaling that the meeting was over. "Sign the papers. Go live your life. Try to be a human being this time." I signed my name through a blur of tears, the ink soaking into the paper like my regrets soaking into my soul. Lucas Graver, the name of a fool. She took the papers, sliding them back into the portfolio with a finality that sounded like a coffin lid closing. She turned to leave, her heels clicking on the stone path, walking away from me, walking back to her empire, back to her light. "Elena," I called out one last time, desperate for one crumb of hope. "Will I ever see you again?" She stopped, but didn't turn around. "No. Lucas, you won't. Because the Lucas I loved died on that operating table in the simulation. You are just the ghost that was left behind." She walked away, disappearing around the bend of the hedges, taking the sun with her. I sat alone on the bench, clutching the release form that felt like a death sentence. I was free. I could walk out the front gate right now. I could go to a bar, get drunk, start over. But as I looked at the empty space where she had sat, I realized that I would never be free. I would carry this prison with me for the rest of my life. The prison of knowing that I held paradise in my hands and crushed it because I thought it wasn't enough. I curled up on the bench, pulling my knees to my chest, ignoring the cold wind. I closed my eyes and tried to summon the memory of the simulation, trying to rewrite the ending in my mind. In my head, I screamed at the doctor to stop. In my head, I saved her. In my head, we were happy. But when I opened my eyes, the gray sky of reality was staring back at me, indifferent and cold. I was the man who sold his soul for $1 and got shortchanged. I buried my face in my hands and wept. Not for the money, not for the kidney, but for the girl in the thrift store dress who would never look at me with love again. The regret was a fire that would never go out, a cremation of the heart that left the body alive to suffer the burns. The grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel was alive with the hum of $1 billion worth of net worth circulating in the room, the air perfumed with fresh orchids and the scent of old money. 3 years had passed since the scandal that rocked the medical world, and in that time, the name Elena Vuong had transcended mere wealth to become a symbol of untouchable grace and power. I stood at the edge of the stage, adjusting the microphone stand, listening to the thunderous applause that rolled over me like a warm wave. A sound that used to terrify me, but now felt like the heartbeat of the city I owned. I wore a gown of midnight blue velvet that shimmered under the spotlights. A deliberate choice to remind everyone of the night I walked out of the shadows and into my birthright. Behind me, the massive screen displayed the logo of the Second Chance Foundation, my new initiative dedicated to ethical organ donation and support for victims of medical fraud. I looked out at the sea of faces, recognizing senators, tech moguls, and the very bankers who had once turned their backs on Lucas. All of them, now vying for a second of my attention. They didn't see the scars on my soul, nor did they know the darkness I had traversed to get here. They only saw the Queen of New York, benevolent and steel-spined. A woman who had turned a personal tragedy into a public triumph. I took a breath. The silence in the room absolute, waiting for my command. 3 years ago, I learned that the human heart is the only organ that can break and heal itself stronger than before. I began, my voice steady and resonant, projected to every corner of the room. We live in a world where everything has a price tag, where people are treated as commodities, and where loyalty is often sold to the highest bidder. But tonight, we celebrate the things that cannot be bought. As I spoke, my eyes swept over the service entrance in the far corner of the room, a habit I couldn't break, as if looking for a ghost that haunted the periphery of my vision. I didn't hate Lucas anymore. Hate requires energy, and I had no energy to spare for the dead past. I felt only a distant, clinical pity, the kind one feels for a building that has collapsed due to a poor foundation. I had heard rumors. Of course, Arthur kept tabs on him. A single sheet of paper in a monthly report that I barely glanced at. He was alive. He was sober. He was working. That was enough. I didn't need him to suffer more. His very existence as a nobody was a punishment far greater than any prison sentence I could have arranged. I continued my speech, talking about the veteran who had received the kidney, the man who was now walking, working, and living a full life thanks to an anonymous donor. I saw a few people dab their eyes with handkerchiefs. They praised my generosity, never knowing that the donation was actually a collection of a debt. A pound of flesh taken from a man who had tried to consume me. In the bustling chaos of the service kitchen, the noise was deafening. A clash of silverware and shouting chefs that served as the engine room for the luxury upstairs. I adjusted my black bow tie in the reflection of a stainless steel refrigerator, checking that my white shirt was spotless. My name tag straight. It read Luke. A simple, unpretentious name for a simple, unpretentious man. I picked up a heavy tray loaded with crystal flutes of vintage champagne, feeling the weight in my arms, a familiar ache that grounded me in my reality. I wasn't Lucas Graver, the CEO who barked orders and fired people for sport. I was Luke, the head waiter of the catering company, a man who arrived on time, worked hard, and went home to a quiet studio apartment in Queens. The irony was not lost on me that I was serving the very people I used to dine with, pouring wine for men who had been my rivals, clearing plates for women I had once dated. But there was no bitterness in the bile that rose in my throat, only a quiet acceptance. This was my penance. This was the balance of the universe correcting itself. I pushed through the swinging doors, leaving the noise of the kitchen for the hushed reverence of the ballroom. Stepping into the shadows of the pillars to do my job, I moved through the crowd like a phantom, offering drinks with a polite nod, making sure never to make direct eye contact, mastering the art of being invisible. I heard snippets of conversation about stocks, about mergers, about summer homes in the Hamptons, the language of my former life that now sounded like a foreign tongue. I reached the edge of the crowd just as the applause died down and a voice cut through the air. A voice that vibrated in my marrow. I froze, clutching the tray so hard my knuckles turned white. Elena was on the stage, bathed in a halo of light, looking like a deity who had descended to earth to judge the wicked. She was speaking about redemption, about second chances, and her words felt like physical touches against my skin. We must remember that our choices define us, she said, and I knew she was speaking to the room. But my heart heard it as a whisper directly to me. I watched her, mesmerized by her strength, realizing that the woman standing there was forged in the fire I had lit. I had tried to destroy her, and in doing so, I had polished the diamond. revealing her true brilliance to the world. I felt a swell of pride, strange and twisted, that I had been a part of her story. Even if only as the villain who made the hero rise. A man in a tuxedo bumped into me, spilling a drop of champagne on his sleeve. He spun around, his face twisting in anger. "Watch where you are going. You idiot. This is a $5,000 suit," he hissed. It was one of my old fraternity brothers, a man I had once gone skiing with in Aspen. He didn't recognize me. He looked right through me, seeing only the uniform, the tray, the servant. 3 years ago, I would have fired him, sued him, or punched him. Now, I simply bowed my head, pulling a napkin from my pocket. "I am terribly sorry. Sir, let me help you with that," I said softly, dabbing at the fabric. He swatted my hand away. "Get away from me. Go get me another drink." I nodded, backing away into the darkness. "Yes, sir. Immediately, sir." I retreated to the shadows, a small smile playing on my lips. It was liberating, in a way, to be nobody. The pressure was gone, the need to impress, to conquer, to lie. It had all evaporated, leaving behind a simple existence of cause and effect. I worked. I got paid. I slept. I had 1 kidney, a small apartment, and a clear conscience for the first time in my life. I had paid my debt. The receipt in my mind was stamped "paid in full." I looked back at the stage one last time. The speech was ending. Elena raised a glass, proposing a toast to the future. The room erupted in cheers, flashbulbs popping like fireworks. She looked happy. Truly, deeply happy. A man walked onto the stage to join her. Not a business partner, but someone who held her hand with a gentle intimacy. He was tall, kind-faced, a pediatric surgeon I had seen in the papers. He whispered something to her, and she laughed. A sound of pure joy that I had never been able to extract from her. A pang of regret hit me, sharp and sudden. The old wound in my side throbbing in sympathy. That could have been me. That should have been me. But I was the wolf who had chewed off his own leg to escape the trap. Leaving the prize behind, I whispered into the darkness, my voice lost in the applause. "Goodbye. Elena, you look beautiful." I turned my back on the light, on the woman I loved, on the life I wasted, and pushed back through the swinging doors into the noisy, steam-filled kitchen. My shift wasn't over. There were glasses to wash, floors to sweep, a humble life to live. I walked out of the service entrance of the plaza an hour later, the cold wind of November greeting me like an old friend. The city was asleep, the streets quiet, except for the occasional taxi. I walked toward the subway station, buttoning my cheap coat against the chill. I passed a newsstand, the late edition already out. The front page featured a photo of Elena from tonight. The headline reading, "The Queen of New York, Elena Vuong's Golden Era." I stopped, fumbling in my pocket for a few coins, and bought the paper. I rolled it up, tucking it under my arm. A souvenir of the world I used to inhabit. I descended into the subway, the turnstile clicking as I passed through, a sound that marked the boundary between her world and mine. I sat on the hard plastic bench of the train, watching the tunnel lights flash by in the darkness. I was tired. My feet hurt, and my bank account was nearly empty. But as the train rattled toward Queens, carrying me back to my small, silent apartment, I realized I wasn't unhappy. I was alive. I had survived the fall. I reached my building, a walk-up in a working-class neighborhood, and climbed the 4 flights of stairs to my door. I unlocked it, stepping into the small space that contained everything. I owned a bed, a table, a chair, and a single bookshelf. It was clean, organized, honest. I placed the newspaper on the table. Smoothing out Elena's picture, I went to the small kitchenette and poured myself a glass of water. Drinking it slowly, I touched the scar on my side again, tracing the ridge of skin. It was my reminder, my anchor. Some men wear wedding rings. I wore a missing organ. It was a fair trade. I sat down at the table, looking at her picture one last time before turning off the light. Good night, Queen, I whispered into the darkness. I lay down on the narrow bed, pulling the blanket up to my chin. Outside, the city sirens wailed, a song of tragedy and triumph. Inside, there was only silence. The ghost closed his eyes, finally at peace with his haunting. The story was over. Justice had been served, not with a sword, but with a mirror. She had risen. I had fallen. And the world was exactly as it should be.